Hi everybody, thank you for coming. On behalf of the Board of Selectmen, Deirdre Guglielmo is in the back, and Richard Shuck. Neil isn't with us just yet, and myself, we welcome you to our Freedom of Information Workshop. Every day there's questions. Seems like every day somebody has a different question. We thought if we brought everybody together in the same room with our friend Tom Hennett from Freedom of Information, that we're going to be educated together.
That's right.
So,
We hope.
So take it over.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. This is amazing. A cold night like this, a crowd like this.
Just tell how many nerves.
I was going to say, it must not be a basketball game or something. Right? Thank you, sincerely, thank you for inviting me. We love doing these sessions, especially when you ask us to come out. It means that you're interested in learning a little bit about freedom of information, basically learning how to do things the right way. And that's really important. The goal tonight is not to try to beat you up, try to make you miserable, to try to, like God, what are we going to do? The idea is to try to help, to try to teach, to try to answer your questions. I encourage you as we go along to ask questions. Things are going to come up. You're going to say something like, that doesn't make sense, or that's not how we do it. There's no problem asking these kinds of questions. Somebody gets in trouble with something along those lines. The idea, again, is to try to help, to teach, to learn. So feel free. It works best if we interact, ask the questions as we go along. I know some of you wrote some down. If we don't get to them at the end, we can do that as well. I always try to tell people a little bit about me before I start. You heard the name, it's Tom Hennick. I'm the Public Education Officer at the FOI Commission. I always like to tell people up front that I am not an attorney. I don't know, is that good news or bad news? The reason I share that with you is that I can't give you any binding legal opinions. It's not about that. It's about teaching, about talking, about learning. But what I tell you tonight is to help you make decisions, but not necessarily anything you can bring to court. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, before I joined Freedom of Information, I'm in my 15th year at FOI, I was a journalist. Is that good news or bad news? How does that play? Some people, that gets a mixed reaction. I was telling Karen before, one of those jobs in journalism, in fact, the one I liked best was as a sports writer. And I remember coming up here, I worked for the Middletown Press, and we played teams somewhere back there, Stafford football, on a Friday night maybe. We played games on Friday night. Memories, I still got it, right? Valley Regional, teams like that. So, but often when I am sitting at my desk at work, and my primary function is to answer questions. People call with questions all the time. And by the way, the offer to call is available to anybody. Anytime you have an issue or question, no question is stupid, just pick up the phone and call. You'll get an answer. I always answer the phone. I call back if I get a voicemail. I have people who will vouch for that. And if I don't know, I'm not afraid to say I don't know, but I'll get you something to work with so that you can make a rational decision. But a lot of times when I feel those questions, I can hear myself kind of in the background in my other life, maybe asking them or directing a reporter to ask them when I was an editor, because it helps me see FOI from both sides. Now the third thing I'll mention, let me just see a show of hands. How many of you are members of boards and commissions? Large number of you. Volunteers, right? So that when you go somewhere in town, you get free drinks and free food, they thank you for your service, right? Thank you for everything you do. Yeah, right. A lot of times when I go out and do these sessions, especially in the evening, people will say, Tom, you don't get it, we're volunteers. We have our real lives during the day, and then we join these boards, and we go, and we're trying to give something back to Stafford, we're trying to do something right, something positive, and then we go there and we sit at these meetings and everybody tells us how dumb we are and how we don't know what we're doing. Well, I get that too. For 10 years I was a member of board in the town where I live, last 5 as the chairman, so I understand that dynamic as well. I understand what it's like to not necessarily be trained in freedom of information. You didn't sign up for freedom of information, you signed up to help your town. You either ran for office or you were appointed to a board to help your town. But freedom of information comes with the package. It's part of what you have to do. It's the law in the state of Connecticut. It's not just some nice idea, some lofty idea, it's the law. So when you go forward in your capacity as board members, you need to know it at least well enough to make sure that you don't violate it, because you don't want to be a board that violates the law. And those of you who are staff members, you're sort of in the same boat in that when the boards and commissions have questions and problems, who do they come to? You. So you need to know the FOI Act as well, so that you can set them straight, again, to make sure that the law is followed. Now, the law is based on a really important principle. It's based on the idea of government being open and accessible. That's the idea. The law, this is a quote from James Madison, mid-1700s. A popular government without popular information or the means of acquiring it is but a prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both. A people who mean to be their own governor must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives. The power which knowledge gives. For democracy to work, people need to know what's going on. It's a pretty simple concept. Connecticut's law is 40 years old. It's based on that concept. If you do the math, folks, 40 years ago takes us right in the middle of Watergate. And when Watergate exploded all around us, Ella Grasso was in Congress. She saw it firsthand down in Washington. And she didn't like what she saw. And those of us who remember it didn't like what we saw. Secret government, government behind closed doors, government that almost brought the country to its knees. So when she was in Congress and she was contemplating to run for governor, and she decided to come back and run for governor in 1974, she said, if I am elected, Connecticut's going to have an open government law, I guarantee it. She made it one of the primary planks in her first campaign platform. As you know, she won, and in 1975, she made it one of the first things that she did. She pushed forward a law that is now the Freedom of Information Act. But she did something a little interesting, and those of you who are politically inclined might get a kick out of this. She said, this is so important to our state that it will be approved unanimously by our legislature. What do you think about that for a second? Has anybody ever watched the legislature? Can you imagine guaranteeing a unanimous vote on that or on anything? She guaranteed the unanimous vote, folks, and she got it. But to get there, again, those of you familiar with the process know what I'm going to say, there had to be a lot of back and forth. There had to be a lot of discussion. There had to be a lot of course, I'm in favor of open government, but not for that record, or not at that time for that meeting. So there's a lot of give and take. So while it's based on this simple, easy concept of government being open, the final product has a lot of gray area. Any of you who have tried to read it, have tried to follow it, have tried with all, good intention to make sure that the law is followed, you're reading it and you're saying, what? I'm not quite sure I get that. My intuition takes me this way, but the law seems to take me that way. Because there are those gray areas in it, it's open to interpretation, which means that those of you who are on the front line have to interpret it sometimes at the snap of a finger, the drop of a hat. You're at a meeting. Gee, should we be in executive session? Should we? I don't know what to do, and you're trying to read it and try. The goal tonight would be to try to eliminate some of the mysteries. But I wish I could tell you that they would all be eliminated. They're not going to, because the gray area remains. And it means that when something happens, you're going to have to make a call, you're going to have to make a decision. You base it on the concept of government being open and accessible. More often than not, you'll be okay. And the idea would be to have freedom of information become something of second nature to you, so that it's not a problem, so that it's not an issue. But guess what? You interpret that law. Somebody on the other side of the issue also has the right to interpret that law, the way the law is structured. And that's where the Freedom of Information Commission comes in. The person on the other side says, you know what? That Board of Selectmen didn't do that right, I'm going to file a complaint. And they file a complaint with the Freedom of Information Commission, which was created as part of the creation of this law to make sure that the law was followed, but we adjudicate complaints. People believe they've been wronged, believe they've been denied access to a meeting or denied access to a record. They file a complaint with the FOI Commission. The Commission looks through all the facts and makes a ruling. It says, town, you were right, or individual, you were right, and says, give out the record or withhold the record. But guess what? That's not the end of the story necessarily. Even the Freedom of Information Commission gets interpreted. People don't think the decision was right, they can appeal it all the way to the state Supreme Court. I'll share a couple of examples with you as we go through the presentation. And you'll see that even our decisions are questioned and sometimes overturned. That's because it's not always in a nice, neat little box. So those of you who've grappled with it or struggled with it, maybe sort of think about that in context and say, well, wait a minute, it's not just me. I'm not the only one making mistakes. because the law sometimes is so open to interpretation that you have to make a call and then live with it. The first thing that I try to tell people when they talk about it is that it's called freedom of information, but it's not necessarily about free information. It's not about people walking into boards or walking into offices and asking questions. People think that it's a sort of a license to just say, I want to know. Freedom of information says, I have a right to know, you got to tell me. Well, it's not necessarily about that. Yes, we're public servants, we answer questions, but it really should be called freedom of access. It's about access to two basic things. It's about access to public meetings and access to public records. Although that doesn't stop people from thinking that it's sort of an invitation to ask all kinds of questions. They come in your office and ask questions maybe, or Karen, they come in your office and freedom of information, I have a right to know. And you kind of have to guide them and say, you can find that out in this record which is available, but it's not mine to interpret it and try to tell you what it is. If that's happened to you, I can tell you that I understand how that goes. People see our name. They see Freedom of Information Commission, and they think we're the information kiosk for the state of Connecticut. They call us up with questions. I'm telling you, some of you wouldn't believe that. First of all, people have this vision of us sitting in this giant vault with every record held by every agency in the state of Connecticut. They call us up and ask us to send them this or send them that, which obviously we don't do. That's not the process. They also call with some questions. I'm going to share one of them with you just to show you how you can get. I told you to answer questions on the phone. So a couple of years ago, I should set it up first. If you're familiar with Hartford, when a big play is coming to the Bushnell, you've seen the flags hanging from the light poles. If you've been in, you know what I see the heads nodding, you know what I mean? So a couple of years ago when Mary Poppins was coming, everybody was very excited. Big play, Mary Poppins is coming to Bushnell. Okay, so I'm sitting on the phone, answering a question about how to notice a meeting or something like that. Phone rings, Tom, you got another call, pick up the phone. Woman on the other end says, it goes something like this. She says, I need your help. So what's the matter? She says, I'm desperate, I need tickets to Mary Poppins. I said, no, well, what? She said, you're free of information. Tell me how to get tickets to Mary Poppins. So I said, no, ma'am, that's not how it works. That's not what we're here for. I want you to know I was a good public servant. I found the box office number, I gave it to her. I hope she got to go to the show. But that's the sort of stuff, people think that freedom of information is a lot broader than it is. It's about that kind of access to meetings and to records. So what we'll do is we'll go through the two parts of it. I'm going to lean the presentation on the meetings portions because many of you are board members. You don't have to deal as much with records requests. But don't let that stop you from asking questions about something that I might gloss over, especially in the records department. It sounded like a music store, records department. Now I'm dating myself, right? But anyway, when we talk about meetings, listen to the definition. This is in the law, state of Connecticut. Meeting means any hearing or other proceeding of a public agency, any convening or assembly of a quorum of a multi-member public agency, and any communication via to a quorum of a multi-member public agency, whether in person or by means of electronic equipment, to discuss or act upon a matter over which the public agency has supervision, control, jurisdiction, or advisory power. The definition says, folks, is that any time your board or commission gathers to do its work, in any way, shape, or form, you're having a meeting. And you need to make sure you've done some basic things. You need to make sure you've noticed that meeting properly, that it's open to the public, and that when the meeting is done, there are minutes created which reflect what happened at that meeting. All too often, people who do what you do or what I used to do get hung up on the name. It's budget season, is it not? Everybody's favorite time of the year. It was just a budget workshop. We're not going to worry about noticing it for FOI. That's wrong. It doesn't matter what you call it. Well, it wasn't really a meeting. It was just a little sort of informal gathering. We were going to talk. If you're doing the work of your board, you're having a meeting, and you need to be really careful that you notice it properly, because if you don't, the law says that you have held an unnoticed meeting and you're vulnerable to a complaint with the Freedom of Information Commission. A lot of times people get hung up on this. They'll say, well, we're a board of 8 or board of 9. We're going to form a subcommittee, 4 members. It's not the whole board, so then they don't have to worry about FOI. That's not the case. The law applies to all public agencies in Connecticut. I didn't read you that definition, it's kind of long. But the definition has a phrase in it that says, including any committee of or created by. So if your board creates a subcommittee, a study group, even if it doesn't have any power, it's an advisory board of some kind, it's a public agency, and it also needs to follow the same rules, meaning the meeting needs to be noticed, it needs to be open, and there need to be minutes when you're done. Another area where we get hung up is the idea of a quorum. People say, well, we didn't have a quorum, so we don't need to worry about FOI. Now, this is being filmed, so I have to be careful how I say this, but as the former chairman of a board, I wish that that were true. Maybe not on a night like tonight, but where do some of the best meetings take place? Up a parking lot when the meeting's over, don't they, right? But don't worry, Tom, they would say as I came out the door, it's not a quorum, we don't have to worry about it. And I said, no kids, that's not the way it works. Even absent a quorum, you could be having a meeting. Now there is an appellate court ruling that says, no quorum, no meeting under FOI. There is a ruling that says that. There is also a ruling that says no quorum, you could still be having a meeting under FOI. We have the appellate court of the state of Connecticut giving us opinions on both sides of the spectrum. I call them the dueling rulings, diametrically opposed. So when people call up and say we didn't have a quorum so we don't need to worry, I say no, that's not the case, because even absent a quorum you could be having a meeting. I use the word could, which confuses the issue even more because it's not every time. But there are cases where the court has ruled, where our commission has ruled that they did enough work, even absent a quorum, to warrant it being called a meeting. So even if you're in a situation where you're thinking, well, we're covered, it's not a quorum, if you're actually physically doing the work of your board, you want to make sure that you follow through and make sure that it was open, make sure that it had been noticed, first of all, that it was open, and that there are minutes when you're done. The idea there is to make sure that you do your work in public. That's the key to this law. Just an example on that. People sort of say, okay, we had a situation in Woodbridge, other part of the state, not that long ago. Conservation Commission was meeting, and then for one reason or another, guy got mad or had to leave or something. He leaves, and they're left without a quorum. So he says, well, you know what? The chairman says, we're gonna keep talking. They had a nice audience, people, they were talking, they went back and forth, and then they said, okay, we're done. Now, they didn't take any action. You may have bylaws or charters, I'm not sure how you're governed, that say, no quorum, you can't do anything. I'm not telling you to ignore that. I'm telling you that if you do ignore that, make sure you followed FOI so that you don't get into trouble. But in this case, they went forward, they did their work, and then the town clerk says, where are your minutes? And they said, we don't have to do any because there was no quorum. Did you sit and do your work? Well, yeah, but there was no quorum, so and they got stubborn. Well, somebody filed a complaint. Guess what? They lost because they had done the work of their board. They should have had minutes. They should have considered it a meeting and going forward. So even that could create a problem for you down the road. So it's easy enough to conceptualize, if you will. Notice it, make sure it's open, and make sure there are minutes. The law talks to us about 3 different kinds of meetings. It talks to us about the regular meeting, the special meeting, and the emergency meeting. The regular meeting is a meeting that you have per a schedule you submit to your town clerk's office by the end of January of every year that says we meet on the 1st and 3rd Tuesday, the 2nd and 4th Wednesday. Whatever that schedule is, that's when you're scheduled to meet. The special meeting is a meeting that you have when you're not scheduled to meet. Now, there's some confusion about that. People think that the special meeting can only be about certain things. And that's not the case. The special meeting can be about anything. So then what's the difference between the two? Well, first of all, the main fundamental difference is the special meeting is when you're not regularly scheduled to meet. It can be any other time, it's just not on your regular time. You must submit an agenda or a notice, the terms are somewhat interchangeable, that indicate what's going to happen at that meeting. What time, place, what the issues are that are going to be discussed. You have that agenda, that notice, you have it in your board's office, if your board has an office. It's also in the town clerk's office. That needs to be available at least 24 hours before the meeting. For a special meeting, it also must be on your website. If your town has a website, it must also be on a bulletin board if you still do that. The other fundamental difference between the regular and the special is that if something occurs at a regular meeting that's not on the agenda, someone says we really ought to talk about that, someone can make a motion to add it to the agenda, and if 2/3 of you vote to do so, you can do that. You can add something to the agenda by a 2/3 vote at a regular meeting, but at a special meeting, you cannot. So when you look at that notice of a special meeting, you can only talk about what's on that notice. Do we have any notice agenda preparers in the room? Anybody who gets that lovely task? Remember that when you do it for a special meeting, a term like other business, new business, with nothing specific underneath it is worthless, because you can't vote to add it. At a regular meeting, although it's not the best thing to have on an agenda, at least if the chairman says, is there any other business? Someone can say, yes, it's not on there, I'd like to talk about topic X, you can vote to add it, all right? I mentioned the website posting issue for special meeting notices. It's a good time to throw out there that there is some confusion about that as well. Back in 2008, the legislature passed a law at the recommendation of then Governor Rel that said that all public agencies, municipal and state, are to put their minutes and their agendas on their websites. All of them. A lot of smaller towns especially complained. They said, we don't have the manpower, we don't have the infrastructure, we don't have the know-how, we're not positioned to do that. In fact, some towns actually took down their websites, which was the exact opposite of what the legislature was trying to do. As I said, this was not our initiative. They just sort of said, well, we're going to pass it anyway. You guys, handle it. You guys enforce it. So a lot of towns struggled, but they got into it. They started putting more and more on their websites. And as it went along, they said, you know what? This is actually working out, because the more that we put on the websites, the more the information is out there, and the less people are calling and are confused, because it's all right there. So then in 2010, the legislature peeled back the law. They changed the law and took away the responsibilities for municipalities, with the exception of that special meeting notice. But many people who worked so hard between 2008 and 2010 think that it's still the law. And they get calls, why aren't the minutes on the website? You violated the law. Well, no, you didn't. But if you're putting them on there, continue to do it with the understanding that you're not violating anything unless it's that special meeting notice that's not up at least 24 hours before the meeting. It's anecdotal when I say to you we find that it works, but many, many people have said it's just a better way to go. The more you put on the website, the more information that's out there, and the better off you are. Now, the third kind of meeting, the emergency meeting, is a meeting that I always try to discourage boards and commissions from using. The emergency meeting is an unnoticed meeting. And again, as I told you, the law really doesn't want you to hold unnoticed meetings. I know that everybody in Stafford gets along really well. There's no fighting, there's no back and forth. But the reality is, folks, when you have an unnoticed meeting, what's the first thing that happens? People get suspicious. Why didn't they tell us? What are they hiding? Why aren't they doing it? So that's one reason not to have the emergency meeting if you can at all avoid it. But a more practical reason, frankly, is the law. The law has set the bar extremely high for what constitutes an emergency. It really wants you to think about having a meeting without notice. Share a little story with you to show what can happen if you think it might be. I'll say two stories, actually. Every Tuesday after Martin Luther King's birthday and after President's Day just passed, I will get at least one phone call that goes something like this. Tom, our regular meeting is tonight, Tuesday night. I forgot we were closed yesterday, so I didn't have a meeting notice. That makes tonight an emergency, right? And wrong. And oops, I forgot is not an emergency in the eyes of this law. Now, it feels like an emergency, does it not? If you take the law out of the picture, it feels like an emergency, but it's not. People think that that's a problem. But a better story, depending on your point of view, over in Ridgefield, again, the other side of the state, there was a situation a few years back where the assistant fire chief believed he was about to become the next chief. He was very excited about it. He was running around town telling everybody he was the next chief until he found out he wasn't. Then he wasn't so happy. He was so unhappy, in fact, that he marched into the first selectman's office one afternoon. He said, "You've got problems," and started screaming and yelling and cursing, and it was awful. I'm told it was one of the best fights in the town hall you've ever heard. Stuff getting thrown off desks. And finally, the first selectman calms him down and says, "Look, you can curse at me all afternoon. You're not going to be the next chief. Period. End of story. But I tell you what, you've been a pretty good employee. We'll make you the interim chief while we look. How about that? The guy wasn't thrilled, but he says, okay, and he leaves. You know, well, it's a small town. Richfield's a small town like yours, like mine. It doesn't take very long. The phone's ringing off the hook. The emails are flying in. The texts are flying in. Did you hear about that fight? I can't believe it. And the first selectman is being told, you got to get rid of this guy. He was insubordinate. He was rude. He was unprofessional. You don't want him around. You got to get rid of him. All that stuff. First selectman thinks about it a little bit. He says, well, maybe there's some validity to that. So he decides he's going to have an emergency meeting the next morning, which is a Saturday morning. He calls the emergency meeting, he brings the selectmen in, they talk about it, they decide the guy's no good, they're gonna fire him. It's a Saturday morning, nobody's there, so they send somebody out to find him. The poor guy is like cleaning his gutters, if it ever, if spring ever comes, you know what I'm talking about, cleaning the gutters, painting the house, something like that. They drag him down to town hall, he's got the ripped sweatshirt, the leaves hanging out of his hair, the whole thing. Comes into town hall, thanks for coming in, you're fired. He gets mad all over again, he says, you can't fire me because I quit. So they reconvene the emergency meeting and accept his resignation. So he thinks about it. Remember what I told you, when people believe they've been denied access improperly, what do? They file a complaint with the FOI Commission, which is what he does. He claims that this was an improper emergency meeting, he files the complaint, and the process is we look over the complaint, if we have jurisdiction, we put a number on it, we assign a mediator. That failed, it goes to a hearing. At the hearing officer takes the evidence from both sides and says, you know what, there was no emergency there. And the hearing officer says, I recommend that we declare null and void everything that happened at that meeting. It goes to the full commission, which is the next step. The commission looks it over and says, you know what, there was no emergency there. We agree with the hearing officer, and we declare null and void what happened at that meeting. Which means that he was fired and or quit at a meeting that basically now never happened. Okay. So why is that would be good enough. But wait, there's more. Richfield, as is its right, remember I told you, people disagree with our interpretation, they take it to court. And they take it all the way to the state Supreme Court. And in January of 2010, the state Supreme Court says, we agree with the FOI Commission. Now, I'm telling you, they don't always. We wish they did, but they don't. And in this case, they did. And they said, we agree with the FOI Commission. There was no emergency there. And we also declare null and void what happened at that meeting. January 2010, which, by the way, is almost 4 years after the actual incident took place. So I tell that story all the time to tell people, look, think of the agita, think of the legal fees, think of just the mess by not noticing a meeting, by not waiting 24 hours. And I say, but I think they finally worked it out. Someone sitting where your first selectman was, this is Christmas time about a year ago, a year and a half ago now, he's laughing his head off. I said, what's so funny? He says, they haven't resolved anything. So we're talking December 2013. Now we're talking almost 7, 8 years after the actual incident. And he says, they're still fighting about it. They can't come to an agreement to make the whole thing go away. I mean, they're arguing about the back pay and the benefits and all that stuff. Last June, May, somewhere in there, I'm reading the Danbury News Times and I see a little article that says, Richfield settles with, and the guy's name. They paid him off. They finally agreed on a number and paid him off. We're talking about, almost 8 to 9 years before. Think of what they've gone through. All they had to do was wait 24 hours. By the way, there's a punchline to this. Why do you think they ultimately settled the case? They were sort of pushed into a settlement by a judge because the person they ultimately hired the first time is retiring. And guess who's on the candidate list for the job? Same guy. So they had to solve problem A before they attacked problem B. Now, folks, this doesn't happen every time you mess up a meeting notice. But I want you to think about it in terms of what could happen. I want you to think about, 8 years of agony. They were stubborn about it. They could have resolved it much earlier. But I want you to say, you know what? We're in a position where maybe we have notice the darn meeting, notice it, and go through with it so that there's no issue, so that you don't make yourself vulnerable to a freedom of information way that could lead to that kind of problem. A lot of times people say, well, what is an emergency? Like I said, the bar is high, but these last couple of winters have given us some pretty good examples. You look up at the forecast this morning, you see not only is it snowing Monday morning, it's going to be snowing Wednesday morning too, and you look in your supplies and you're out of road salt. And you got to get some really fast. So you have to call your Board of Finance together pronto, transfer some money so that you can go out and buy some more road salt. Keeping people safe, keeping people out of harm's way, that's where the bar is for that emergency meeting. And if you ever have a situation like that, where you need to have an unnoticed emergency meeting, have the meeting, and within 72 hours, the law says you must create minutes that reflect what the emergency was, who was at that meeting, and what you did about it. If you're in a position like that, folks, remember that you can only talk about that emergency situation. There is a terrible temptation. I get it. Well, as long as we're here, we have such a hard time getting together otherwise, let's talk about other stuff. Don't do it. You can only focus on the emergency again. Okay. Remember that your meetings are open to the public. Anybody can come. Sign-up sheets are not really a good idea. You can have them, but just don't make them a prerequisite to coming into the room. Anybody can audio or videotape a public meeting. Has that ever been a problem here? Ever been an issue for anybody? Sometimes it is. Sometimes boards are camera shy. They don't want to be in the camera. But the law says, section 1-226 says that anybody can audio or videotape. Now, as a former chair, I get a little sort of, I don't know, skin crawlies about this. People will say to me, well, they have to tell you that they're recording. You know, today, these little recorders in the phones and stuff like that, well, unfortunately, folks, the answer to that is no. And I say unfortunately, you know, with sincerity. So you should always, common courtesy would say that you can tell somebody you're recording, wouldn't it? You know, common decency, but sometimes people don't. So just assume, you know, for safety's sake, if you're worried about it being recorded, then it is being recorded. But you do, by the way, have a right to run an orderly meeting. Those of you who are in charge, you know, this is the meeting room, and the camera can only be over there or over there. The microphone's only over there, so that someone's not running back and forth disrupting the meeting. You have a right to run an orderly meeting and get your work done. So it's required that you allow it. Yes.
I have a question that someone wrote down for answering if you can. I
Sure.
think this might be a good time to ask it. If a video is made of a meeting, where does the video get housed after the meeting? Is it to be treated like an audio tape?
Okay, if the town makes the recording, where it's being housed is up to the town. But it does need to be housed, it becomes a public record. If a private individual makes the tape, it's up to the individual. So if it's a town equipment and a town recording, then the town should have a system for preserving it. There's a whole set, Karen, of records retention laws, as you know,
Right.
that tells you how long you have to keep it.
Right.
But that part is not in the FOI Act, but it should be available. Yes, sir.
I don't want to waste our time here because I have some important issues, but in the November election cycle, there was a debate between 4 candidates running for state representative. I'm sorry, 3 candidates. And the debate was held in a town building, senior center. And it was sponsored, however, by the League of Women Voters, which is a private organization. People tried to film the debate, and they were told that an agreement had been made by the 3 candidates ahead of time that there would be no filming. And there was some dispute over that. Is there a ruling regarding that?
Good question.
in FOI?
That would not be a public agency. League of Women Voters would not be a public agency. So what I just said would not apply.
Even though they're using a public
That's
building?
correct.
Okay.
It doesn't matter. It would be up to them. Yes, sir, Matt.
I have a question concerning the recording of meetings. I work here at the library, and we have DVDs of meetings that people can check out. But I was asked a question, or I had a discussion, that copy, or that meeting to be checked out, should not be the original, because someone can check it out and it can get broken, it can get lost.
That would not be our law, but what you say is very wise. It makes a lot of sense. So I would agree with that. I would agree that for people to borrow the original would be a mistake because of all of what you just said. But it's not, if someone says, I gotta see the original, then you probably have to arrange a viewing, you know, with somebody watching to make sure that it doesn't get swiped or something like that.
And I'm sorry, I don't want to monopolize the meeting. As a follow-up, someone said, someone asked me a question, if someone records a meeting, can it be edited, or does it have to be the entire meeting from start to finish?
If the someone is a private individual, they can do whatever they want with it. You know, when this law was written 40 years ago, you'll hear me reference this perhaps again, it didn't envision the extent to which we all could do this kind of recording. that piece was sort of written for media, basically. The media would come in, and it was understood that they would, get snippets, sound bites, things like that. But now people record the whole thing and they put them on YouTube, and then when they edit it, it becomes, just doesn't follow, you know what I mean? And they edit out important parts, but there's no control over that. They can do with it as they will.
Clarify, that's videotape with town equipment.
Okay, if it's town equipment, it becomes a town record, and then the town has to control that. If it's an individual on the side, then there's no control. But even then, the town's got control. If the town edits it, there's not much you can do with that either. But the full video needs to be available. If the town edits pieces of it, puts it on YouTube or something like that, there's no control there FOI wise, but the whole thing has to be available. Remember also that this law does not give anybody the right to speak in a public meeting. Many people believe that it does. Many people believe that the FOI Act guarantees them the right to speak. It doesn't. The right to attend, the right to observe. So what that means is that the public speaking portion of a meeting is in the hands of the board, which often means in the hands of the chair, but the board has to determine if it wants public. Now, look, again, former board chair here, of course you want public participation, because that's part of the process. But you are not violating FOI if you walk into a full house one night and say, you know what, I can't stand it. I'm not going to listen to these people again. And you don't have. You may have other problems. You may not win re-election. You may be violating town policy. I don't mean to minimize that, but FOI does not govern public speaking. So when we get complaints from people that say I was not allowed to speak at a meeting, we have to kick it out because our law does not give us the power to enforce that. This is especially helpful around this time of year at budget time. Boards, commissions may need to impose a limit, a time limit. You want to hear from a lot of people who have ideas about how to frame your budget, how to put it together. But you've got a lot to do and you don't have enough time to do it, so maybe you limit it to 2 minutes or 3 minutes. My advice there would be, if you're going to do that, be consistent. Don't let you speak for 3 minutes and you speak for 5 and you don't get to speak at all because you don't like it. You just don't want to do it that way. You just don't want to do it that way. Now, I'm making a lot of noise about making sure your meetings are open, accessible, and all that. There are a couple paths that boards can take to keep the public out, to operate behind closed doors. The first one is executive session. Has everybody heard the term executive session, what I'm talking about? Yes. Remember, folks, that an executive session is a portion of a publicly noticed open meeting. It's not a separate entity. So even if the only item you have is an executive session item, you still must notice the meeting. The meeting must be opened in public, and the board must then vote to go into executive session by 2/3 of those board members who are present. When in executive session, remember that you can only discuss. You can discuss as long as you want, discuss, deliberate, but when that's done, you then have to come out of executive session to take whatever action you're going to take. Don't ever vote behind closed doors. The law is very clear about that. Make sure you take all your action in public. Yes, ma'am?
I have another question. When a board enters executive session, do they have to state the reason for the executive session?
The next thing I was going to say is absolutely, because when you're going into first of all, if you know, it should be on your agenda. If you know you're going to have an executive session item. And I asked the question last week by somebody in one of the sessions I did, can we have a standing item that says executive session just in case? Not a good idea, because the law says that the public has to be fairly apprised. So it should say on your agenda, executive session, likely discussion of a town hall employee. You don't necessarily have to name an individual in a personnel matter, but you need to say more than personnel or legal matter. You need to vote to go in by 2/3, and the motion, not only should the agenda say it, the motion should say it as well. It should specify what the reason is that you're going in.
And that needs to be reflected in the minutes.
Yes. There are 5 specific reasons for an executive session. Broadly stated, a personnel matter, pending claims, pending litigation, a security matter, sale or lease or purchase of property. You're going to build, well, you don't need one, but you're going to build a new school somewhere, and you're looking all over town for land, and you're negotiating with landowners, things like that, and have those discussions behind closed doors. 5th one is something of a catch-all. It allows a board or commission to go into executive session to talk about the content of a document or documents that you believe are exempt from disclosure. You ask your attorney for a written legal opinion. It's a written legal opinion you're not going to share with anybody else. It's covered by the attorney-client privilege. You would go into executive session to talk about the advice that your attorney has given you. Does anybody here work on a board that deals with bids or RFPs, anything like that? They are exempt from disclosure until you've signed a contract, until you've concluded negotiations, one or the other. So let's suppose you're the police commission and you're put out bids to the various local automobile dealers for new cruisers. And you want to study them, you want to look at them behind closed doors. You can do that because the bids are exempt documents at that point. You sort of spread them out at the table and look at the different bid alternates and things like that. It's just a couple examples on the document side of executive session. Minded, yes.
I'm sorry, I
No.
had personnel litigation, what was the third one?
Security.
Security, thank you.
So let's wind it back to the personnel executive session, because that's one that hangs a lot of people up. First of all, as I said, make sure that when you make the motion, when you put it on the agenda, it says more than just personnel. You need more than that. Secondly, the individual that's going to be talked about needs to be notified. The person has to be told that he or she is going to be the topic of an executive session. That person then has the right to come forward and say, I don't want an executive session, I want you to talk about me in public. And if the person does that, the board cannot, under any circumstances, go into executive session. The conversation must be held in public. So the individual comes forward and says, I want it to be discussed publicly, that's it. It's got to be done publicly. Now, what sometimes happens is that the person says, I want it done publicly. And the board knows that the conversation probably would be better off for all involved if it were held behind closed doors. So it says to the individual, we get what you're saying, but what if we invite you into the executive session? You can tell us your side of the story. If the person's okay with that, that's great, because the law allows the board to invite in whomever it wants to give evidence, to give testimony. So there's an executive session on the table. The board thinks it needs to hear from an individual. They invite that person in. The person says what he or she has to say, but it's critical that you understand that the person must then leave. You don't want to kick everybody else out and let somebody else stay. You don't want to create a second audience. So the person comes in, gives his or her side of the story, and then leaves when the board begins to deliberate. There's a counterintuitive piece here, if you think about it. The law does not guarantee anybody who's going to be talked about the right to demand to be in the executive session. Now, if you think about that for a second, you're saying, wait a minute, you're going to talk about me and I don't get to demand to be in the room? But that's exactly what the law says. The law says you can demand that it be discussed publicly. They can invite you in if they want to, but there's no inherent right to go into that executive session once you waive that right to a public hearing. Pending claims and pending litigation is pretty much what it sounds like. There's a lawsuit on file or perhaps a letter of intent to sue. And there's also sort of a little add-on that says if a board is contemplating taking legal action, if a board is contemplating suing somebody or taking legal action to protect the town's rights, you could have that discussion behind closed doors as well. If you think about it, that makes sense. Why would a board talk about suing somebody in public and tip that person off? So you could have, that extends a little beyond something that's actually pending. Yes?
Well, that's an issue though. When does a dispute arise to the point where it's a pending claim?
There's gotta be something in writing.
That's
Pretty much,
right.
yeah, pretty much. I mean, it can't be somebody standing up and say, if you approve that site plan, we're gonna sue you. It's gotta be more than that.
All right, so it can't be just the fact that disagreement may come forward. So
That's
it
correct.
could be
That's correct.
either a letter from someone or like a threat to sue.
Letter of intent to sue or an actual lawsuit,
Okay.
yes. Really should be something in writing. The security executive session, I will be honest with you, that's one that rarely got talked about until Sandy Hook. I don't like using that even in this context, but the reality is that after that incident, school boards especially had executive sessions to talk about extra security personnel, extra security devices, extra cameras, things like that. And the law is specific. It says that if you're going to talk about those things, you can have those conversations behind closed doors. Remember, again, don't vote behind closed doors. Make sure that you vote in public. And make sure that your minutes ultimately reflect who voted for what or for whom. Any questions about executive session? Yes?
Can we go back to like bid documents and contracts?
Okay.
Yeah. what point do they become public documents?
Once you've either concluded your negotiation, say you're gonna rebid the project, then all those would come out, or when you've signed a contract. They all ultimately come out, nothing gets withheld.
Right, but I mean, if, as first selectman,
Yeah.
myself and an attorney is negotiating a contract.
Mm-hmm.
The attorney feels comfortable, advises this is the best we can do.
Yeah.
And I have to bring it to the board of selectmen
Right.
for authorization
Right.
to sign the contract.
Once it's signed,
Once
out
it's
it goes.
signed,
Right.
then it becomes,
Now, there's a point here.
Yeah.
This is an exemption, and when we talk about records, you'll see this. It's a permissive exemption, which means it's something you're allowed to do. But at that point, if you want to release it, nothing stops you from doing it. The law doesn't say you can't, it says you're able to withhold it.
So you're allowed to withhold the bid document or all bid documents?
All of them, all the submit, now, not the actual bid that goes out, the bids that come back in, the bid documents that are returned.
Okay, so those do not become public knowledge?
They do not become public knowledge until the contract is signed or negotiations are ended.
Okay, so if they put out a bid for a school
Mm-hmm.
and they decide on XYZ contractor gets the bid, awarded the project.
Okay, first of all, when that point comes and they vote to do it, at that point, everything comes out.
So all bids
All of them,
then
right?
become exposed?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct.
can I just explain, maybe enlighten a little bit, I can answer the question better. If we put a RFP out and we get three responses back for the RFP, and we choose one of the three, and through negotiations, that falls apart, we don't want to disclose to the other two maybe what that one that we were willing to accept was.
Mhm.
So that's where I was going with.
So you renegotiate with one of the other ones or with that one? So let me
Or
read
you
you the
put it, or
exemption.
you put it back out for bid.
Okay, once you put it back out for bids, they're public.
Correct.
These three are public. This is how the we're wandering a little from meetings to records, but that's okay. Here's how it's written. 1-210B24. Do I sound official when I do that? Anyway, responses to, you're allowed to withhold responses to any request for proposals or bid solicitation issued by a public agency or any record or file made by a public agency in connection with the contract award process until such contract is executed or negotiations for the award of such contract have ended. So if they're still negotiating, if they're still working on it, it can be withheld. Yes, sir, go ahead.
Just one question about the security elements.
Yeah.
I can see if, let's say there's been thefts in the locker room and the Board of Education gets together and says, we're going to install a secret camera or something to try to find out who's, stealing items. But if it's the town deciding to purchase, let's say, 5 different kinds of security items, different systems, and they're not talking specifically about how or where they're going to be used, but there's financial considerations involved, there has to be, budgetary outlays. Would that be, would that come under the security as a blanket or not?
Excellent question. The answer in my mind is no, it would not. If talking about the dollars would tip somebody off, I mean, it gets a little bit fuzzy there. If we spend $100,000, we can hire X number of guards, but we may only be able to hire 50, so it's X, and you may be tipping off the bad guys, then it might. But the way you just described it, just general outlay, I would say no. It would not be proper for executive session.
Thank you.
Okay? So, executive session. Are there any other questions about executive sessions?
I have a question about previous topics.
Yeah, sure.
Just to back up regarding the special meetings.
Mm-hmm.
Meeting location gets changed.
Yeah.
I know you can post it announcing the new location. Does it then become a special meeting?
Okay. You'll love this. There's a yes and a no to that. Let's suppose we come to a meeting and the room is clearly not big enough for anybody, everybody. You can, and the word in the law is adjourn, which drives me nuts because you really haven't started it yet, but that's the word in the law. You put a sign on the door that says the room's too small, we are adjourning this meeting to the high school auditorium to accommodate everybody. Then it remains your regular meeting, okay? But if it's a situation where you cancel it and move it to another location, then it becomes a special meeting. So if it's sort of a continuing, do you watch
So you have to
basketball,
change-
the
you'd have to change the
continuation?
agenda to take off any new business, it would be Specific.
if it becomes a special. This comes up a lot, not so much with running out of space, but it comes up a lot in the wintertime. Oh my God, it's gonna snow, we're scheduled to meet, what are we gonna do? Technically, you can adjourn the meeting without even starting the meeting. Put the sign on the door, everybody goes home, and we adjourn the Monday night meeting because it's supposed to snow tomorrow night. Real example. We don't wanna meet, we're gonna wait till Thursday night. So you put a sign on the door that the meeting will be held, this meeting will be held Thursday night, this time, this place. If you adjourn it to a specific date, time, and place, the regular meeting part carries over. If it's canceled because you don't have a new date, then it becomes a special meeting. Okay? Now, the other path. You want to take a deep breath on that one? Yeah. The bottom line is, folks, that people get hung up on that regular special thing. And if you've got a sort of a complete agenda, it's not that big a deal. But the other business, new business, old business thing is what you have to knock off if it becomes a special meeting. The other way, the other path that boards and commissions take to exclude the public is one of those areas where I wind up banging my head against the wall. Because it's very difficult to sort of explain and describe. I read you the definition of a meeting. The sentence in the law that follows that says, meeting does not include. Meeting does not include. There follows a list of gatherings, get-togethers, whatever you want to call them, many of which everybody in this room would call a meeting. But for the purposes of freedom of information, the legislature said they're not meetings. Call them whatever you want, but they're not meetings, which means they're not noticed, they're not open, and there are no minutes. Do we have unions in Stafford? Okay. Anybody here have the delightful task of being involved in the collective bargaining process? All right. You sit at a table for hours. You make a proposal. They laugh. They counter. You laugh. You're there all night, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Are you not doing the work of your board when you're negotiating that contract? Isn't that one of the primary functions? My board, by the way, was the Board of Education. Please don't throw anything. But when you have a situation, the teacher contracts and administrators, look, that's the bulk of our money. That's serious stuff. That's key work for our board. But for the purposes of FOI, when we were sitting there all night, they weren't meetings. Collective bargaining is not a meeting under FOI, so it means it's not noticed, it's not open, and there are no minutes. By the way, the term that people have started to use about this sort of thing is a non-meeting. Has anybody heard that term thrown around? A non-meeting. So you sit there for 4 hours and it's a non-meeting. By the way, try doing that some night and going home and telling your spouse that you spent 4 hours at a non-meeting. Doesn't fly. But that's what people have taken to calling it. Collective bargaining. Executive level search committees. The superintendent of schools is going to retire. You form an executive level search committee to look for the new superintendent. That group meets outside of freedom of information. Now, there's some logic to that one if you think about it. If you're looking for a new superintendent, you want the best. And a lot of them might already have jobs, so you're allowed to do that really in secret so that it's not known to their current employers that they're looking for a job. Social gatherings, chance meetings. A lot of times people will join boards and they'll call up and say, no, I can't go out to dinner with my friends, I'm on the board with them. Well, that's not the case. I mean, the reality is that these meetings take place all the time, but listen to the wording, I get a kick out of this. It is not a meeting if it's a chance meeting or a social meeting either planned or intended for the purpose of discussing matters relating to official business. What else are you going to talk about? Let's have a reality check. Let's not be naive. Those conversations do take place. My recommendation is to be very careful what you talk about and don't set the budget over the eggnog at the Christmas party. You know, make sure that you're cognizant of the fact that offline conversations could be a meeting and could be a situation where you could have a problem. Somebody could file a complaint. You don't want to have your real work tossed away because you've had a conversation that went too far when you're out for dinner. Another one in that category, and I almost hate to bring this up, has anybody heard of the caucus? Is Stafford a political town?
Yes.
Yes. The caucus means that members of the same board and the same party can caucus, can talk about anything at any time till the cows come home. It flies completely in the face of the context of open government. Same board, same party. Where people get hung up is they invite other people into the room. Let's have the road foreman come in. Let's have the police chief come in. Let's have the town chairman come in. Only same board, same party. If you choose to caucus, make sure it is only same board, same party. This is an area where I believe there was a lot of debate when this law was written 40 years ago. This is one of those areas that sort of came out sort of mushy. A lot of people complain, hey, shouldn't that be a meeting too? Because think about it, you've got a board that's got 5 members of one party and 3 of the other. The 5 of them get together and caucus legally. Aren't they going to be setting everything up to, to knock down the pins when they go to a full meeting? Shouldn't that be in public? Well, I would think so, but the law says no. If you're going to caucus, though, remember, only same board, same party. By the way, the argument, people, they sort of got them to vote. Remember I told you unanimous vote? The argument was, oh, don't worry about that. That's just going to be about, like, who brings donuts to headquarters on Saturday morning and stuff like that. And we all know that that's gotten a lot broader than that. It's a good time for me to point out something in the definition of meeting. Remember, when I read it, it said, whether in person or by means of electronic equipment. The electronic equipment piece was put in there 40 years ago for the powerful chairman who would get on the phone and say, okay, I need your vote on this, you're voting that, you're doing this thing, bang, boom. Walk into a full house. Okay, good evening, meeting's in order. All in favor, all opposed. All in favor, all opposed. And everybody's looking around, what happened? Where was the discussion? It took place on the phone before the meeting actually happened, and you can't do that. And in 2015, we're talking about a lot more than telephones, aren't we? We're talking about texting, we're talking about emails, we're talking about Twitter, we're talking about things that I can't even comprehend. I confess I am a technological dinosaur. The bottom line is, do not stop using these devices to disseminate information. The chairman of a board wants everybody to see a piece of paper, a letter, something they got from a constituent. It wants everybody to see how he feels about something. Folks, the budget's coming up. This is how I think it should go. All fine. A problem comes when you start a conversation via those vehicles, emailing, texting, things like that. That's a problem. That could be an unnoticed meeting and could get you into a lot of trouble. You want to avoid that. So think in terms of using those devices to get information out, to ask a simple question. Gee, I missed the last meeting. Can you tell me what happened with item X? Could we please put this on the agenda? That's the way we communicate today, let's face it. But let's be careful that we don't have the conversations via those vehicles that you should be having here at the table. Because remember, just by the way, those texts, those emails, all those things are public records. So if somebody asks to see them and it's clear that you've had multiple conversations with board members, you've got a problem. Karen, another one?
Question. This is about, I guess, I'm not sure if I'm gonna explain it right, but social media.
Yeah.
A group of people on, for example, the Board of Finance are discussing the town finances on Facebook. And there's 3 or 4 of them responding.
I would strongly urge them not to do that. I would strongly urge them not to. I don't know the context, I don't know the detail. That's just asking for trouble. Because it could be construed as that they're having a conversation amongst themselves. You really want to be careful with stuff like that. I'm not saying it is or it isn't, but I would avoid that. Yes?
But you are saying it's okay for that one person to have put it on the social media page, just it's the other people who have responded have made it a problem.
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay.
Just want to be real careful with that. And by the way, that's just a suggestion. Who knows if somebody files a complaint? A lot depends on what the actual content was and stuff like that. You just want to be real careful. Yes.
I want to clarify, but I mean, if 2 members of a board are having a phone conversation.
That could be a meeting.
Just-
That could be a meeting. They're not of the same party.
Does it have to be a quorum?
No.
for every meeting? Well,
It must have been
that's
late.
not-
No, it's never been.
Never been.
It's never been. No. Yes, sir.
With social media,
Yeah.
there's so much misinformation.
Ah,
And we'll go back to, I'll use Board of Finance, for example. Somebody posts some misinformation or asks a question. If a member gives an answer as to something that transpired at that previous meeting.
again, so
To
dependent, it's so
clarify-
fact specific.
Right.
A member sees something that's wrong on a Facebook posting and says, look, just for the record, that's not what happened. And it ends there, that's probably okay. You know, you just gotta be real careful the extent to which they're communicating with each other.
Okay, one of the reasons I came tonight was to discuss an issue that was very important to me personally. It had to do with this kind of thing, where people who are on commissions have informal meetings, social settings, and so forth, where topics are discussed. And there was a letter put out by the town that I thought cast a sort of a hail over the constitutional rights of people who are on boards and commissions.
Okay?
And I have the whole letter, but just the last paragraph sort of summarizes it. It says, most importantly, to protect the integrity of the process, no elected or appointed official shall be associated with or actively taking part in any community group whose purpose is to influence any decisions made by the town of Stafford. While we are all citizens and taxpayers, outside the voting booth, we inherently lose our right to act as individuals and private citizens when it comes to matters that affect the community and are governed by law. With the technology that is available and chances of these types of meetings being videotaped, there is a substantial risk of liability to the town for policymakers to inadvertently predispose themselves on one side of an issue or another. This could be grounds for appeal on certain applications and possibly expose the town to legal action resulting in punitive damages. Now, I began service on commissions in 1974. I was chairman altogether on 3 for 30 years. I never went to an event. I was chairman of the Recreation Commission, where somebody didn't come up to me and say, you know, it'd be better if this field was lit,
Right.
or why don't they have the gyms open at 4 o'clock? Church people would come up and say, why do you play basketball on Sunday mornings and so forth? I can see if somebody attempted to pretend they were representing their whole committee or speaking on behalf of the committee, but to discuss with your neighbors, answer questions about, you know, what's going on, why isn't this being done, what's the problem with this? To me, that would, you know, just preclude any kind of public discussion at all. I think it's much too broad and incorrect.
Okay, well, way beyond my pay grade, I told you not an attorney. Here's what I'd say to that. That appears to me to be an attempt to caution people about what I was just talking about setting yourselves up in a situation where it appears as if you're having an improper meeting. Now, if it's one-on-one with your neighbor, probably not going to worry about it. But if it's 2 or 3 people on your board at another group's meeting, and you start to talk as if you are speaking for your board, and you haven't noticed your board's meeting, and somebody files a complaint that says they were there doing their board's business, I mean, it's all very fact-specific, but it could be a problem. Now, there's another piece to that that's clearly not FOI. Let's suppose that board, and I'm speaking out of turn here, I want you to understand that, but I'm just reacting to what you just read to me. You could have a problem with something called ex parte communication. You could have a problem if you've got a situation where somebody's got an application pending somewhere, and you start a conversation about it, and you're then about to go vote on that. Recreation might not have that situation, but P&Z could, ZBA could, zoning could. I think, you know, it may have struck you the wrong way, but I think the intention of something like that was to warn you about what we just talked about. Be careful about the settings in which you have communications, discussions as a board member or with board members, because it could be construed as an improper meeting. At least from an FOI standpoint, I understand that. You just got to be really careful, because you're vulnerable. Let's suppose you have a discussion like that, somebody hears it, then you go and you vote on something and say, wait a minute, they made that decision based on an illegal meeting, and files a complaint with the FOI Commission. The snowball then is rolling down the hill.
But I don't understand that. And I taught political science for 41 years.
Yeah.
I was a university professor.
Yeah.
That seems to contradict every ruling I've ever seen on freedom of speech. For example, if you're talking to, I mean, I can see if you have 3 members of your board and you're saying, you know, we're going to do X, Y, and Z.
Right.
But if you meet somebody in a grocery store,
No, that's different. I just said that's different. If you're meeting somebody at the grocery store, you're having a conversation.
they come up to you and ask a question.
That's certainly fine. But if you've got multiple board members and you're in a
Multiple board
discussion, then you're right. The one-on-one thing, again, I said out of my element here, but I've heard enough people talk about that ex parte communication. You're the chairman of planning and zoning, and your neighbor comes up to you and says, that application is stupid, that's awful, that's gonna ruin our neighborhood. And you say, don't tell anybody, but I agree with you, and I'm gonna vote that way. You're having a conversation that you probably shouldn't have.
So what should the answer be? Thank you for
Thank
giving me
you for
your
that.
opinion.
I will take that back to my board.
Okay.
I will take that back to my board.
Just one final thing.
Sure.
At a PTA meeting or a discussion
Yeah.
of funding for schools and so forth, practically every elected official and a lot of the appointed officials in the town are there.
Right.
People get up and publicly make statements about the budget, what should be done, closing schools, opening schools, you know, different programs and policies and so forth. How would that relate to this kind of a warning? I mean,
Also a good question. The PTA is having the meeting. And the law says, in that thing that we just talked about, things that are not a meeting, members of a board, all of them, can go to another group's or another board's meeting without noticing a meeting. So if they go to that meeting and listen to this conversation and hear the PTA people say, you know, cut this, add that, it's no problem. But if they then huddle and start having a conversation about what they've just heard at that PTA meeting, then they've got a problem.
Or outside in the parking lot.
Or outside the.
They still have a problem.
Right, they still have a problem, that's correct. And again, folks, we are not the FOI FBI. I'm not listening to this and coming back here tomorrow night with handcuffs. We don't have to until somebody files a complaint. You need to understand that. But what I'm trying to do is give you the tools to work with so that that complaint doesn't happen.
So
Okay?
one of the issues like with Facebook is if your friends and your friends and your friends are all board members, that in itself could be misconstrued as,
Right.
because they all get the information and the only people that can see that information are your friends. Now you're having a private meeting.
Yeah, you just want to be careful. And you know, again,
Right.
until somebody brings it forward, you just want to be careful, okay? I'm watching the clock. We'll stay all night if you want, but that's okay. Yes,
I just need clarification.
yes,
Right now, we have a selectman and two others, a three-member board.
Yeah.
If we change to a five-member board, if two people are still talking, it's considered a meeting.
could be, yes.
Okay.
Depends on what they're talking about the horrible snow, or hope that it melts.
So there's not, so in that case, there's not really a benefit from going to a five-member to a three-member, because we were talking about a quorum. But you
From an
don't,
FOI standpoint, there's no difference.
okay,
There's
thank
none.
you.
You may have other reasons, you know, 5 heads may be better than 3.
Right, I just,
But
but
that's
two
not- there's
people
no
is
FOI.
considered a meeting.
None.
Thank you.
Can I expand on that? Like when Selectman Haas comes in to do bills on Wednesday,
Yeah,
you know, he may find a bill and come in, walk into my office
Yeah.
and say, Rich, what's this?
let's not get crazy, that's fine.
Right.
Okay?
But
But if he starts berating you about it, and you
Right.
start debating it, I would say I would avoid that. Hey, he seems very calm now, though. But you would say, look, we gotta talk about that at the board meeting. We can't do that here.
Right. Now, if, for instance, he had an area of expertise, like the medical field, in a medical office, if I wanted to ask his opinion or questions on something that would affect one of our offices.
Again, let's not get nuts. You're gathering information. You're not making decisions. And your caution is well placed because, you know, again, I don't speak with any knowledge here, but there are some people who use the FOI Act as a weapon, as a means of getting back at people. We don't encourage that. In fact, we discourage that. We try to get people to stop that. But unfortunately, they're out there. If it makes you feel any better, we have one who is making our lives so miserable now. Last year, he filed 200 formal complaints. And when he doesn't get his way, do you know who he files complaints against?
You.
Us. I want you to think about that for a second, by the way. Think of the logic of filing an FOI complaint against the FOI commission with the FOI commission. But anyway, so they're out there, so, you know, be careful, be smart, but, you know, understand that you just don't want to get caught up in this.
So we can converse for information.
Exchanging information is not, should not be an issue. Yes, in the back.
You've talked a lot about meetings and boards. The information that is in your records,
Yeah.
that had nothing to do with a meeting, that had nothing to do with a board getting together,
Yeah.
but had to do with your day-to-day business.
Yep.
How much of that is available to someone through an FOI request?
Well, you to hold that thought for 1 second. I just want to put a wrap on
Oh,
these
sorry.
meetings, and then we'll talk about records for the time we have
Okay,
left. I
sorry.
just want to do one other thing on meetings. Who does minutes? Anybody in the room do minutes? Poor, unfortunate soul. I feel your pain. I do the FOI commission meeting minutes. I get it. Here's my piece of advice on minutes, folks. They need not be the recreation of War and Peace. They are not every word that everybody says, although there are some in your audiences who would like it to be that. There may be some at your board tables who would like it to be that. It's not required. Minutes, really, the only technical requirement is a record of who votes for what or for whom. Obviously, you're doing more than that. You're creating the historical record. You want more than that in there, but it's not a verbatim transcript. It's not every word that everybody says. You come up with something that you and or your board and or your town, some combination therein, is comfortable with. You put them together, and you make sure they're available within 7 days. Now, the question that always comes up is, well, wait a minute, we don't meet again in 7 days to vote. Doesn't matter. The minutes need to be available within 7 days. If there are any corrections, additions, anything like that, you do it at the next meeting. Once they're in, they're in. Okay, let me jump to records. I'm watching the clock. I don't want to keep you here forever, but we need to talk a little bit about public records. Again, board members, bear with me. That doesn't apply to you as much. But you need to understand a couple things about public records. I'm going to read for you definition, 2 parts, very short. Public records or files means any recorded data or information relating to the conduct of the public's business. Prepared, owned, used, received, or retained by a public agency, or to which a public agency is entitled to receive a copy by law or contract, whether such data or information be handwritten, typed, tape recorded, printed, photostated, photographed, or recorded by any other method. Part 1. Part 2. Except as otherwise provided by any federal law or state statute, all records maintained or kept on file by any public agency, whether or not such records are required by any law or by any rule or regulation, shall be public records. And every person shall have the right to inspect such records promptly during regular office or business hours, copy such records in accordance with Section 1-212, or receive a copy of such records in accordance with Section 1-212. The law in the state of Connecticut, which I just read to you very quickly, says that every record, every document held by every member of every public agency in the state of Connecticut is defined as a public record, period, end of story. And in theory, anybody can ask to see it, or anybody can get a copy of it. But if it were that simple, let's go home. It's not. On top of those base definitions, there are what we call in the freedom of information business the 3 E's. There are exceptions, there are exclusions, and there are exemptions to disclosure. Oh boy. So why, you say, do you read us these definitions and then tell us about these 3 E's? Because the first step towards compliance with the records provisions is understanding that everything's a public record. And not sort of doing it in reverse, saying, well, these are mine, these are P and Z, these are selected. Everything's a public record, then you look at whether any exemption or one of those things fits, and then you pull it back. All too often, people who do what we do get very, shall we say, possessive. They're mine, you can't have them. They're the town's, you can't have them. Or they get selected. You look like a nice guy, we'll give them to you. You, however, look very suspicious, we're not giving them to you. And you used to be a journalist, so we're sure as hell not giving them to you. Step number 1, doesn't matter who's asking. I told you about difficult people, we all have them. Doesn't matter who's making the request, doesn't matter what they're asking for. Everybody deserves a fair shot, and then you apply the different exemptions, all of which may fit. You may wind up giving up nothing, but never say, it's you can't have. I used to make up a little story to share with people about what not to do when people made an FOI request. A couple years back, Hartford, God bless them, gave me a real live example of what not to do when you get an FOI request for records. The person making the request is someone who had darkened their doorstep several times. Not a bad guy, by the way. He'd just been there a lot. He's sort of a quasi-journalist. He does a blog, he does a public access TV thing, and he'd been around a lot. And in this particular instance, he asked the city of Hartford for 2 things. He asked them for a record of bills submitted to the city by a law firm. He wanted to see the bills that was doing some outside work for the city. And then he also asked for a record of payment from the city to the law firm. The Corporation Counsel's Office, the attorney for the city of Hartford, responds, I have your FOI request and will coordinate the response. Such documentation as is allowed or required by law will be provided. Now, folks, when you get a request for records, the first thing you have to do is respond within 4 business days. I don't care what's being sought, I don't care what it is, always respond within 4 days. If you're a board member, do it yourself, or go to the staff that you work with, but always respond. And that's a pretty good 4-day response. It doesn't mean produce the records within 4 days, because you may not be able to do that. If it's an agenda that's sitting right there, obviously you can turn it right over, but if you have to look for them or review them, 4 days. In addition to what he wrote there, I would recommend, if you could, giving him some sort of a time frame, give him some sort of an idea when the records are going to be available, but okay. So what's the story? Why is this a good story? Because in the process of responding to this individual, whom he clearly does not like, the corporation counsel in charge of FOI for the city of Hartford accidentally copied the individual on an email he had written to a colleague about how much he didn't like him. Everything you do is a public record at the start. Now, this is one that would not have seen the light of day had he not hit the wrong button, but clearly it was a public record, and now it became really public. We have mixed company. I'll clean it up, but you'll get the idea. Carl, so who lit a fire under this? It's a bad word that starts with an A. If he's involved in litigation, ongoing, or other projects that he hasn't asked about, can I shut him down? So his response isn't really, I'm looking into it. He's a, how do I get rid of him? Remember, I told you this guy's a journalist. It's on his blog, boom. It's on the public access TV, boom. He's connected. It's in the Current the next morning. It's on WFSB. You know how they bleep the curse words out? You know, okay. So the corporation counsel says, you know, maybe that wasn't the best thing I've ever done. And he tries to sort of rally, but he hates this guy so much he can't do it. This is in his letter of apology. Apparently you have little else to do other than to pester me in this office and other city departments. Recall that I do not work for you. The purpose of the FOIA statute is not to provide you a playground. Folks, even if you think that, right? I mean, really, what are you doing? So P.S., so he gets hammered again for writing that ridiculous letter. He won't give him the records because he doesn't like them. The guy files a complaint. None of the records are exempt because he didn't look first. Hartford loses at FOI commission again.
Oh, by the way, the guy still has his job, though.
No, he's
In
gone.
Hartford, he's gone, finally?
Yeah, but you ready for this? I shouldn't say this. Somebody else hired him. I mean, he's gone in Hartford, but somebody else got him. Anyway, so the bottom line is, you look at the request, even if it's somebody who makes your skin crawl, and you say, okay, he's asking, she's asking for this, I'm going to review it, I'm going to see what's exempt, what's not exempt, and then you go forward. Avoid that. People expect that kind of reaction. When you get a request for records, my recommendation is always, first of all, to make sure it's clear in your mind what's being sought. Because a lot of times people just throw it against the wall to see what sticks. So take a look, see what's being sought, and if you have anything in your mind that creates doubt, if you're not sure, go back to the individual and say, look, you've asked us for this, but what do you really want to find out? You may get a request for, dozens and dozens of records, and look at it and say, this doesn't make any sense, and then have a conversation with the requester, and the requester can say, well, I really don't need all that. You can help them narrow the scope of the request. You would be shocked at how often that creates incredible goodwill, first of all. Second of all, less work for you. Third of all, they find out what they need to find out much more quickly, costs them less money, everybody's happy. People expect that Hartford reaction, unfortunately. The law's 40 years old, people still expect to get told to go pound sand. And if you reach out and you try to work with people, even the difficult people, you'd be surprised how well that works. Karen, do I see your hand?
Yes, I have another question. It's a two-part question. If, say, for example, someone is looking for information regarding a complaint, say from a tenant, when can we release the file requested, and two, should we or could we withhold phone numbers and email addresses?
Okay. Phone numbers and email addresses, probably not. I'm not following the question entirely. Maybe the person who submitted that wants to clarify it, come up afterwards.
Okay.
They didn't want to do it.
Okay.
But bottom line is that if the request is for the records, you look at it to see if an exemption fits. So there's no real general answer to that. They want to look at it and see it's either exempt or it's not, and then they'll give it out.
As a follow-up to that, can I ask this question?
Sure.
Our attorney one time told us before that if a person felt like they were being harassed, we did not have to release.
Okay, see, there's another piece. A lot of times, I told you, I answer questions on the phone, and both sides of the issue will call. And one side will sort of give me this set of facts, and I'll give them an answer, and they'll be happy. And then they'll give me another set of facts, and they'll be happy. Well, somebody's got the wrong answer. It really, so much of FOI compliance is fact-specific. Now, the fact that you're talking about somebody being harassed, potentially in danger, that clearly changes the paradigm. Clearly, you wouldn't want to withhold the phone number because you wouldn't want the person to be in danger. So then it would be a yes. But you'd have to look at 1-210, I think it's B19, which talk about somebody's safety, somebody's well-being, and then you could pull the record back. Yeah.
In responding to a request for information, an email would be adequate in
Yes.
a response?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
To look for these exclusions, exemptions, where would I look?
Okay. Now, here's the part that gets hard. We've been here for a while. We could spend hours doing them. Let me give you a quick overview. Let's hold the questions. I'll give you a quick overview on the 3 E's so that you know how they work and you can know where to find some of them, okay? When I read you the definition, it said, except as otherwise provided in any federal law or state statute. That means if there's a federal law or state statute on the books that says thou shalt not release, it's a record that you don't give out, period, end of story. The problem with that is, and this doesn't answer the question, is that they're all over the place. There are federal laws and state statutes. We don't have a list anywhere. So you need to, my recommendation there is to look at whatever statutes govern the records that you deal with on a regular basis and see if there are any statutes. Quick story. I told you, year 15 at FOI. When I first got there, they had to train me to go out and do this. Talk to people, answer questions on the phone. So they finally felt comfortable letting me go out and do this, and so they said, okay, you're on the phone. So the first week I'm answering questions on the phone, a woman calls up and says to me, I would like to see my child's teacher's evaluation. Child's teacher's evaluation. Now this is pre-Board of Ed days for me. And I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking, gee, I'm a parent. Not a bad idea, child's teacher's evaluation. So I looked through the FOI Act, frontwards, backwards, sideways. There's not a single word about a teacher evaluation. You can look at it today, there's not a single word about a teacher evaluation. So I said, I think you can have it. The person fortunately heard me give the answer. What's the matter? Well, now seared into my brain is the fact that section 10-151C says that teacher evaluations in Connecticut cannot be released, public school teachers. Did anybody know that?
No.
Okay, you learned something tonight, right? But if you didn't have somebody tell you that, or you didn't have it in front of you, you wouldn't know it. By the way, I told you I was a journalist. One of the things I covered for years, education. In May, I'm happy to tell you that I will be married to a teacher for 32 years. I had no idea that I couldn't see her evaluation. You know? Because you didn't, you know what I'm saying? So you need to look at the statute, except as otherwise provided. And that is something that says you cannot give it up. You know, there's anybody from the education world here, FERPA. There's a federal law that says you can't give out records that personally identify students. It overrides a lot of FOI. It overrides a lot of what's in that law. Exclusions. The primary exclusion that we deal with on a day-to-day basis is section 1-217. It's in the FOI Act, and it says you don't give out the home address of certain individuals. Judges, correction officers, police officers. The problem with that is that it created this whole firestorm. The law was changed. It no longer applies to tax records, land records, or voter records. But did anybody see the stuff on TV about the guy in New Hampshire who was buying voter lists, putting all that stuff on a website somewhere? You see that? That created a whole new firestorm, and now all the people who were covered by 217 are running their town halls demanding that their addresses be taken off voter lists, not realizing that the law was changed 3 years ago. So no voter lists. But let's suppose that you're on the Park and Recreation Commission, as the gentleman was, and he's got a judge who sits on the commission with him. Someone wants a roster of your members, the judge's address would be taken off before you gave it out. The exemptions, the third of the 3 E's. Section 1-210 of the FOI Act. You're asking where to find them? Section 1-210, there are 27 categories of records in there. Here's the difference. The first two that we talked about are shall not release. These are may not release. We talked about the bids. They fall into that category. We talked about the attorney-client privilege. They fall into that category. These are records that you are allowed to withhold. Yes?
What was the number again?
1-210.
Thank you.
A couple of them that come up a lot. People say, well, wait a minute, I'm sitting in a board meeting, I'm taking notes. You're telling me that's a public record? The answer is yes, it's a public record, but it's an exempt public record because there's an exemption for personal notes. So you're allowed to give them out, but if you don't want to, you can pull them back. There's an exemption for things that are in personnel files. A lot of times people come from the private sector to the public sector and they say it's a personnel file, nobody's going to see it. Wrong answer. Personnel files are public records as well. However, if the person in charge looks at what's being requested in that personnel file and believes that releasing it would be an invasion of the person's privacy, is allowed to hold it back. Now, invasion of privacy comes to us from a 1993 state Supreme Court case. It involved a teacher. Her name is Perkins. She objected to the release of her attendance records. The court said the attendance records of all of us who work in the public sector or public records, period, end of story, have to be released. And to have been an invasion of her privacy, the court said, releasing those records would have to have been both highly offensive and not a matter of public concern. So if somebody walks into town hall and wants to see an employee's personnel file, the person in charge looks at it and says, would releasing this be highly offensive and not a matter of public concern? If it meets both prongs, the person in charge then goes to the employee and says, somebody wants to see these. I think it's an invasion of your privacy. You say, I don't care, then out it goes. But you say, yeah, I agree, it's an invasion of my privacy. At that point, the record cannot be released until the person making the request files a complaint with the FOI Commission. And the Commission says, Stafford, Stratford's next week. Stafford, with all due respect, you're wrong. There's no invasion of privacy there. You must release the records. Quick illustration. Case out of Middletown. Rumors of a police officer doing a lot of things that were not, having a lot of trouble at home. Really struggling at home, trouble in his home life. The rumors got so strong they put the guy in desk duty. They do a complete and thorough investigation. Complete and thorough investigation. They do a report, an IA report, internal affairs. They do the report and decide, yeah, he's having a lot of trouble at home. It's all well documented in the report, but he's doing a great job as a police officer. They put him back on the street. The Current wants to see the report. They heard the rumors too. Middletown PD looks at it and says, you know what? This is clearly an invasion of this guy's privacy. No one has a right to know what's going on in his home life. The Current, as is its right, files a complaint with the FOI Commission. The FOI Commission looks at it and says, there's a lot about the guy's home life. It'd be really offensive to let the world know about that. And it's not a matter of public concern because it's clear that he's doing a good job. There's a complete disconnect, meets both prongs of the test, complaint dismissed, the report's not released. One of the areas where people get into trouble with personnel files is that they automatically go to the employee. Someone asks for my personnel file. The person in charge doesn't look at it. There is no invasion of privacy in there, but they come to me and I say, I don't want it released. When the complaint comes in, the town has to defend the decision not to release the record, not the person whose record it is. So it's always important to look at the records that are being sought before you send them out. We've really sort of shortened the records provisions. Are there questions about things with records and access to records that you guys want to talk about? Yes?
If I go to a board of selectmen meeting and they pass out supplemental materials, should those be available to the public?
It talks about being available during regular office or business hours, so I would suggest that the next morning would be appropriate if they don't have a copy that night.
Okay, so you can just
Yeah.
call or ask to see a copy of it then?
Yeah.
How about PowerPoint presentations, if there's something like that?
Again, if it's like by a private individual, somebody comes and makes a presentation to the board and then skedaddles, probably be hard to get it, but if they've got a copy, they should be able to make a copy for you.
But what if the chair or the board or selectmen have made PowerPoint themselves?
Oh, it would be a public record,
Yeah.
so at some point you should be able to get it. It might be a little more difficult with a PowerPoint to get it the next morning, but you should be able to get it.
I have a question about the commission.
Mhm.
How is the commission established, or how do the people decide
of our commission. There are 5 gubernatorial appointees for 4-year terms, and there are 4 appointees by the heads of the Senate and the House. The majority and the majority, and they have 2-year terms. And they must be ratified by one section of the House when they're appointed.
Have there ever been amendments to the original?
Every year, to the point where you could cry. As people who are advocates of open government, because here's what happens. Well, it's just one little exemption. And then, since I've been there, the number of exemptions has jumped from like 20 to 27. Oh, it's just a little one, let's not worry about it. And what happens is it's another chip in the wall. People talk a good game about open government, and it's really important, but the reality is they don't want to follow it. Many people don't want to follow it. 9/11 had a lot to do with that, and Frank, again, not to cast aspersions on the actual events, obviously. There was a knee-jerk reaction to bring things off the table after 9/11, and also after in Connecticut.
So you're not appointed by the government?
No, we're staff. We are staff, yes. We're state employees, there are 15 of us. Most of my colleagues are attorneys. To defend our decisions in court, to hear the cases. Yeah. Karen, did we get all the questions on the list?
I have all the questions that were answered here. Some people thought they might have a few though.
Oh, absolutely. I just want to make sure we hit all the ones that were written down.
Yep.
Yes, sir.
Okay, I have an issue I think we deal with is overbroad record requests.
Mhm.
Now, how specific does the request have to be?
You want,
Like if someone gives you every single document related to this,
okay.
I mean, how do you respond to that?
All right, first of all, let me back up for a second. One of the big questions is always, how long do we have to respond, to get the records? Remember that no request under FOI means that you bring your office to a screeching grinding halt. It doesn't mean stop everything and do it. The law says that you must provide access to records promptly. Anybody know what that means? Promptly.
I read that in there.
Well, respond within 4 days, but nobody really knew what that meant, and it went to court shortly after the law was written. Of course, as we got you on this one, promptly means without undue delay.
Well, that clears it up.
Yeah. So, but it allows you latitude to interpret what prompt is. How much you have to look at the records, where they might be stored, who's on vacation, what season it is. People walk into a registrar's office 5 minutes before the election, and they get laughed out of the office. 3 weeks, 4 weeks after that, they might be able to get the records in 5 minutes. A lot depends on circumstances. So when you get one of those requests, and it's this, you say, look, can we narrow the scope, that discussion we had before? If they won't do that, then you look at it and say, okay, we'll give it to you, but we have a right to review it, and it's gonna take, 6 weeks, 6 months, whatever it's gonna take. Your sort of defense against those broad requests is to make it clear that it doesn't mean you're gonna bring everything to a stop, and that maybe by saying how long it's gonna take, and also how much it's gonna cost, you can charge up to 50 cents a page for paper records, and you can get your money up front if the cost of copies is gonna exceed $10. So put those two things together in a conversation with the requester, you might be able to have another conversation that narrows the scope. But if all that fails, then you come up with a time frame. We can give this an hour a week, we can give this 3 hours a week, whatever you're comfortable with, and then do the math, and that's how you work with something like that. It's not a perfect solution. We have had discussions and are having discussions, partially fueled by Mr. 200 that I told you about how to deal with folks like that. The problem is crafting legislation to shut people down is kind of against what we're about, so it's kind of a slippery slope. And other questions, other thoughts? Yes?
Regarding the FOI request and your ability to produce the information, if there's an FOI request, but the information's already publicly available,
Mm-hmm.
whether it be for meetings, say personnel record, payroll contracts and so forth, are you still obligated to follow through and do that? You can't just say,
Ultimately would be, but the first thing I would do is say, hey, look, that's on the website. You can get that on the website, it's there. Many people don't know that, and that works. But if somebody's trying to jam you up, then you ultimately might have to produce it. But you can certainly maybe send them an email with a link to the website. If all that they're asking for is, take the steps to try to avoid doing the extra work by all means. By all means. What else? Yes?
You said that you could be charged the 50 cents per copy per page or whatever. Is there anything about photocopying or taking an actual photograph, or like bringing a scanner in to a
scanner.
public place?
The law allows a person to use a handheld scanner to copy records by him or herself. The law is specific as to what that handheld scanner is. It specifies the technology. Unfortunately, once they passed the law, the technology became obsolete about 5 minutes later. So, but it's clear, there was a case in court, someone wanted to use a portable flatbed, and the court struck it down and said, no, it's clearly one of these wanding devices. Now, the call I get a lot is this: someone's in here and wants to take pictures with the phone. Again, the phone, even 5 years ago, didn't do what it does today. My advice there is, look, I don't really know whether the telephone would qualify as a handheld scanner. I really don't, because there's some people have an app on their phone. But, so, my suggestion is that the law says you can charge $20 when someone wants to come in and scan, $20 a visit. So take the $20, let them use the phone, and let somebody else be the test case. That's what I would recommend. It's not, doesn't have to be free, but that's how I would do it. Again, that's not in the law, that's just how in my mind, that seems to be the best way to do it. What else? Other questions? Other thoughts? Okay, we've been here for a little more than an hour and a half. We now know everything there is to know about freedom of information. Tomorrow morning, somebody walks into one of your offices and says, I want a record. You say, no, we're not going to give it to you. Tom says we don't have to. Remember that you're making a judgment. There's a lot in this law that's interpretive. So you make the judgment based on what you think is the right call, and the person doesn't agree. Surprise, surprise, they file a complaint. When the complaint comes to us, we review it. First of all, we got to make sure we have jurisdiction. A lot of times we get complaints against, the YMCA or Little League or something. They're not public agencies. We don't have jurisdiction. Or the complaint comes in 30 days after the alleged violation. After 30 days, we don't have jurisdiction. Things like that. But let's say we do. We then docket the complaint. We put a number on it. And at the same time, we assign an ombudsman, which is a fancy name for mediator. We try to work with you. I don't know if anybody in this room has had a complaint filed against him or been a complainant. We really try to work it out so that you don't have to go to Hartford for a hearing. But let's suppose that fails. When you go to the hearing, you are never required to bring an attorney. It's one of the last vestiges of the People's Court. You can come to the FOI Commission without counsel, and you're allowed to state your case, they state their case, and so it goes. And I've showed you other examples about, how the process goes all the way to the Supreme Court. The FOI Commission, what can it do? And for the most cases, it tends to be an educational institution. It doesn't really try to be punitive, but if it believes that a violation is particularly egregious, it will declare a meeting null and void. And it can also level civil penalties against individuals, not against the town or a board, against individuals, anywhere from $20 to $1,000. You could be personally liable for that. That doesn't happen very often, but that's one of the powers that our commission has. So I just urge you to think in terms of what we talked about tonight, being open, being accessible, and making sure that you're following that path. The other thing is, I mentioned this before, don't ever hesitate to pick up the phone and call and ask a question. If you're at all uncertain about something, I'll get you an answer. You don't have to follow it, but it'll at least give you some idea, what to do. Now, Karen and the town prepared some really neat packages. They stole my thunder a little bit. I always like to say I bring parting gifts, but they already have it.
Is this the best way to reach you on the back?
The phone number on the back, and ask for me. We're a small office. I will always get back to you.
And that is so true. You are so responsive.
Well, you're kind. I call these the FOI American Express card. Don't leave home without it. They're really great for a wallet, a purse, a desk drawer. Really good, help you make decisions on the fly. So take one of these and put it somewhere where it's convenient when you're doing your town work. And these can be helpful too. And there's other things in there. There's highlights, there's a copy of the law, but these, for quick glance, can be helpful too. I call this the meeting cheat sheet. It's a grid about how to notice meetings, when to notice meetings, when minutes need to be done, things like that. That can be really helpful too. Are there any other questions? Seeing none, class dismissed.
Thank you.
Thank you.